Well, here it is. Did you ever think we'd reach this day? We have been at John for a long time, and we've come to the point where it kind of gets wrapped up, but yet it doesn't. It just this continuation of things that keep getting opened up in front of us. As we saw last week, Jesus had taken Peter aside and reinstated him. That's the word that always gets used. More or less just said, Peter, go do what I've called you to do. Don't worry about what you've done. And now we pick it up at verse 20. Who would like to read verse 20 through 23 for me?
What chapter are we in?
Chapter 21. Susan, go for it.
Peter turned and saw following them the disciple whom Jesus loved, who had lain close to his breast at the supper, and had said, Lord, who is it that is going to betray you? When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. The saying spread abroad among the brethren that this disciple was not to die. Yet Jesus did not say to him that he was not to die, but that if it is my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? This is the disciple who is bearing witness to these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true. But there are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written.
Thanks. Here again, we see this little interplay between Peter and John. It's been kind of a highlight of John's through this last part of his book about, showing Peter. And as I've said, Peter represents us. He's kind of the everyman, through his ups and downs and trials and tribulations, his bold statement of faith and his turning into a quivering bowl of jello in the corner. All of those things get wrapped up in the person that is Peter. And now try to imagine this. Peter has gone away from the fire where the fish is roasting and the other disciples are gathered. And I kind of look at Jesus putting his arm around and say, hey, Peter, let's go for a walk here. And he's talking to him. And Peter turns around after all of that and he sees John. John was following Peter. We don't know the reason why John was following him. Was it because they had this rivalry? Was it because John wanted to hear what Jesus was saying? We don't know. John never says what his motivation was. But what we see is Peter, and this has been taken a few different ways over the years by different commentators, but Peter turns and says, what about him? Jesus has just told Peter what his future, what his purpose, what his destiny is. And Peter looks back and sees John and says, well, what about him? Some people have seen this as still that rivalry. I tend to look at it as Peter is genuinely curious. It's like, Jesus, you've told me about me. Now, what about my friend here? What about him? What's his purpose? And Jesus is, it seems on the surface, a little gruff. More or less is, what's it to you? But that's the purpose behind it. What business is it of anyone's what the Lord chooses to do in and through somebody else? I see Jesus here as kind of nipping something in the bud, because he knows there's this rivalry between his followers, especially between Peter and John. You know, you had Peter, James, and John, who were kind of that inner circle who went with Jesus a couple of different times to see things nobody else did. And I see Jesus kind of setting the stage here and saying, guys, you've got an important test to do. Don't spend a moment worrying about what somebody else is doing. Boy, that should be Christianity 101. Anytime somebody comes to Christ and anytime somebody joins a church, that should be one of the first things that we teach them. What God is doing in you is up to you. It's not up to anybody else, or it's not up to you to compare yourself to anybody else. How much heartache would we eliminate if we took that to heart? But how much time and effort do we as Christians spend comparing ourselves to others? Well, they have this and I don't, so I must be doing something wrong. Or we look at somebody else who's going through a hard time and we wonder why them and not me. Or vice versa, the person in the middle of the hard time is going, how come this is happening to me, Lord? How come you're not taking it out on them? Paul addresses this a little bit when he's writing to the church in Corinth, as they're starting to argue about who has what spiritual gift. And we've seen that play out in 21st century America, where people in churches start to look at what others are doing and saying, well, I want to do that. They get to do that. How come I can't? And what Jesus is doing here is just kind of telling his followers, stop it. It's not up to you to decide what I'm going to do for somebody else. So don't worry about it. But then John also has to add in this part about he had to set the record straight because of that comment that Jesus made. What's it to you if he lives till I return? Suddenly now, the followers were saying, he's never going to die. It's interesting how often people take one thing that Jesus says and blow it out of proportion and start rumors and start to plant divisions in churches over one simple line that is usually taken out of context. There's been countless books written about those very subjects, all because we as humans like to compare ourselves to others. We really do. When was the last time you watched a television show? What do they have on TV shows? Commercials, right? There's been an entire industry over the years built around comparing what we have to what other people have or what we quote unquote deserve to have. And we fall for it. We fall for it hook, line, and sinker because we have this desire to have what everybody else has. Again, it goes back to what I say is the definition of sin. It's the middle letter of the word, S-I-N. It's about me. It's about what I want. And if somebody else has something and I want it, well, I'm going to take it. I give you the Middle East. That's what we do. And what Jesus is saying here is simply just stop that, especially when there's something greater to do. There was a book that was written back in the probably the mid 90s now. I don't often recommend books to people because everybody's tastes are subjective. But it was written by a gentleman named John Bevere called The Bait of Satan. And it's one that I recommend for anybody that I know that's going into church leadership or is in a leadership position. I used to have my church councils read it every year because it's all about the sin of taking offense. And the basic premise is Satan comes in and tries to drive a wedge between believers. And he uses pride and being offended as the tool to drive that wedge. And it really goes back to right here. Jesus knows that that's our human nature. And so as he's getting ready to turn the reins of his ministry over to his followers, he's laying that very basic groundwork right here and telling Peter, it's none of your business. And then John just kind of wraps up. There's this prologue, and basically it's John saying, all of these things that I've written, I know they're true. I was there. But there's so many other things that if it were all written down, there wouldn't be enough room in the world for all these books. It's kind of this nice little stamp that says there's more to the story than we'll ever really truly know. I always like to compare that line to the very beginning of the gospel. In the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God, the Word was God. Talking about this whole idea of a world that has God and Christ at the center. Wraps it up by saying that world that Jesus created can't contain everything that he has said and done. And that's John's way of more or less saying there's more to the story than we'll ever truly know on this side of eternity. I can't wait for the day when it all gets revealed. When that giant light bulb goes on over my head and I go, oh, that's it. Until that day, this is what we have to work with. This is what we've been given. We've been given these words of John as things to guide, things to motivate, things to inspire us. And my hope and prayer through all of this time in this study is that this has been an inspiration. There have been little nuggets that you've been able to pull out and to cling to. And this is where I turn it back over to you. It's homework time, folks. The assignment was pick a passage or a phrase or a person and tell us why that's important to you. So who would like to start? Susan?
I always like to get it over with. I don't remember. I didn't write down a verse, but love others as I have loved you, which, part of it is, love others. The other part of it is set an example of loving others to others.
What would that look like?
Well, I was thinking of family situations where the relationship between the parents affects how the children's relationships will be with other people, for one thing. Or the way the teacher treats people in a classroom, this way the kids will treat each other to a certain extent.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Notice Catherine has fled the building.
Can I back up a minute? Sure. Add one more thing. We were talking beforehand about the Middle East, and part of it is Israel as a country, if they would love others as they love themselves, in other words, like we're kind to their neighbors, they would be in a much more secure position. It's a variation on that, but it's
Isn't that whole golden rule thing? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But that's taken us down a rabbit hole that we don't all the time in the world isn't going to be enough to solve that issue. So who would like to go next? Diane, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I'm a fan of the Get It Over With Club also, Susan. So the one I chose was turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana. And I chose it because I could identify with the difference between water and wine. That was very clear. And I mean, there were a lot of symbols in there. The ordinary people were the ones who understood and saw what Jesus was doing. But then the heart of it for me was the transformative power that Jesus has in our lives and how he can take what's ordinary and make it extraordinary by faith. And that just, that transformative power was, I thought it's just a little vignette that really shows that in a way I could identify with.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Who'd like to try to go up against that one? Sharon, go for it.
Well, the verse I chose was cemented into my heart 50 years ago when we were on a different spiritual journey, a deeper one. And it's John 10:10. I have come that they may have life and have it abundantly, or have it to the full. And that has just continued to guide me, to inspire me, to make me grateful, and to correct when I wake up one morning and say, is this the abundant life? And then what have I done? What do I need to do? And so it just has an all-encompassing kind of a guidelight, a beacon in my life.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Who would like to go next? Catherine.
Every time I read John, it's the first verses. They just touch my heart because he explains so much and it's so beautiful. The first 5 verses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. It just touches my heart just to have it so clear and so just out there, you know. I that's what I like and what touches me especially.
Sometimes I think that John would have been better served just stopping right there. And then written a second book about everything else. But yeah, that's very powerful. Thanks, Catherine. Marilyn, go for it.
I had the same. Actually, I didn't even get past John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I mean, I think you could take that like they'd say, you know, if you're on a desert island, what book would you want to have? You just need that sentence, and that would keep you busy for a long time pondering what that really means. And I've been noodling about this because I've been assigned to preach on Christmas morning, and that's the gospel.
And that's the text.
And yeah, I love it.
My wife has a Catholic priest friend who used to say, Christmas Eve is a baby story. Christmas Day, you get theology. Because that's the text, that's the reading. Who would like to go next? Hulda, go for it.
My favorite is from John 20, in verse 23, and I'm reading out of the Message. If you forgive someone's sins, they're gone for good. If you don't forgive sins, what are you going to do with them? So, it's pretty powerful. Don't need other people's
like
sins
that.
weighing me down. Like,
I like that. I like that. Again, there's a whole Bible study based on that one reading.
Yeah, and that essentially everything should be forgivable because God is bigger than all of this. And that takes a lot of time to process.
Yeah. Anybody want to go next?
Joanne Allen wasn't able to come today, but she gave me a verse.
I'm here now.
Oh, yay.
I got in the car and I thought I have enough time, so I'm on my phone. But now I can't remember what I said. So you go ahead and read it.
Trust in God always. Trust also in me.
That was mine.
Yeah.
Yep. Would you care to elaborate on that for us, Joanne?
Well, in our lives all the time, when everything's really out of whack or out of control or whatever, just remember, have faith, trust God. And Jesus said, and I'm here too to back them up, or we're the same one. Trust me too. I'll be there too, I guess.
Very good. Very good. I chose John 1:14. You know, I love that first part of John, and you know, we've had Catherine and Marilyn talk about how powerful those first verses were. And for me, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, taking all that is of Jesus as God, as creator, and then coming down here with it to be with us. Every time I stop to just think about that, to ponder that, my little brain just starts to boil because there's so much richness in the fact that the Creator God would take time out of his busy life to come down here to hang out with us and to touch us and to guide us and to lead us. And coming into this Advent season, I mean, that's really what this whole thing is all about. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The rest is in the details, as John points out. That's what we got. That's what we got. Now that we've gone through all of this, any questions, comments, concerns, anything that's bubbled to the surface, going all the way back to the beginning of all this? Diane.
Well, I was almost going to nominate John as the writer of this, because I think now that I understand it a little bit better, I can see how he had a mission and how he used his creativity and his literary skills to make his point and tell his story so that we would get it. And that made me think that previous to this study, I had always thought of John's gospel as being kind of beyond comprehension, you know, kind of airy and very spiritual and very deep and philosophical, and I couldn't understand a thing of it. Well, I'm probably, you know, a little bit of it is now understandable to me, but I don't have the sense that it's this esoteric, unattainable, wispy thing anymore. And I don't know if that's anyone else had that experience with it or not. I'm just curious about that perception of the whole book.
That's why I love to study it. Because a lot of people have that same thought about it. It's like Revelation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems to be beyond our ability to comprehend and understand it.
And so why bother? Kind of.
Yeah, so why bother? And I think it's worth a bother. I really do. And now, Diane, you have just embarked on a lifetime journey going back and reading it again and picking it apart even more.
And again and again and again, yes.
And again and again. And I hope through this process, you've kind of seen the pattern that I use in walking through this. Take it in little small chunks.
Mm-hmm.
Look at what that passage is saying. Look at it in the context of what's around it and the greater context of Scripture and into the historical context. A good study Bible comes in really handy doing stuff like this. But then let it rattle around in your head a little bit. And it's like, what is that saying to me now? Because what it's speaking to you today is going to be different in 5 years. It's going to be different in 5 weeks. But the more we go back and take it in those small, manageable chunks, the more sense it makes. You don't have to try to digest it all at once. You know, and I would encourage you to do that with anything that you're studying. Don't overwhelm yourself. Don't drink from the fire hose, as they say. Drink from the little sippy cup.
We were talking before 11 about the cartoon versions that Catherine used to show of things. And I watched them last night, and they don't go into the depth, but they do show the big picture. And since this has been spread out over so much time, it was worthwhile to me to go look at, here's the big picture and how this is laid out. So we decided I'm going to send out those links to people when I send out the link to the video. I'll identify it. It's in 2 parts because it was too long to do in one part. So you'll get 3 links when I send the video.
That's a great suggestion, Susan. I'm glad you watched that and we can be
Yes, thank you.
recorded. Yeah.
Thank you.
When I was watching it, I somehow rather got into some other podcast or something, but it was put in as an ad of obviously Jewish men talking about the fact that Jesus really was the Messiah. And that there's a whole movement of the Jewish Jesus followers.
There is, yeah. I would like to segue into, because Hulda's here, to tell her that we've been trying to get some ideas expressed last week at least, and some have emailed me before about ways to go forward. And I'm just wondering, Hulda, where you are in the process, if you could answer, like, how do you have a certain time commitment that you would devote to this, or what kind of thinking have you been doing?
I was thinking 8 weeks would probably be good, just January and February. And maybe 1 New Testament and 1 Old Testament. I don't know. But I'm not picky about where we go or what we study.
A couple things that have been expressed is one, Basil suggested maybe doing a character study of David, tracing his, pilgrimage in the Old Testament. And someone, Diane, had thought maybe doing something with music as it gets translated into and from the Bible as to how that connects. Otherwise, some of the verses, some of the people were, it was just like maybe the prophets. We've done some of them, but not for a while. But with a time of 8 weeks that the diocese is doing Luke, so we don't, but I don't think we need to do, isn't it Luke, Diane, that they're doing? Yeah, we did that a year and a half ago. And we could do it into 8 weeks, but I think that's too recently that we've studied it probably differently that you would do it, but still, I think I was thinking, oh, let's keep giving you suggestions rather than do that. Anybody else have anything they'd like to contribute? Or
Basil, didn't you mention Romans or Corinthians too?
Yeah.
As well as the minor prophets. You don't want to do Isaiah, I gather.
Not in 8 weeks.
Not, you might get through the first 3 chapters of Isaiah in 8 weeks, but
Also, the smaller stories toward the end of the Bible,
Yeah, I thought that too. There's a whole bunch.
Yeah, there's a whole that we don't really talk about that much.
Yeah, like James and
Yeah,
Jude
all
would be a
those
really good one.
ones. What'd you say, Basil?
Jude would be really good.
Jude. I mean, deacons are supposed to know the gospel, so
No better way to learn it than teach it.
this is our way of helping you.
I'm not really thinking of I'm gonna be the teacher, but you guys are really the teachers. I'd be more of a guide, I guess, or I don't know. Yeah, I like the idea of doing a bunch of the lesser known gospels, or the character of David is also interesting because you could tie music in through Psalms.
Yeah.
So I'll think about it and come up with something. But what I wanted to say about John before we leave it is it's actually come up in my professional life as being too controversial, because there's St. John's Passion by Bach, and an oratorio society wanted to do it, but it's some of the lyrics are too anti-Semitic and no one wants to go near it right now. And so having gone through it with everyone at this pace and really digesting it, like I can see where it feels anti-Semitic sometimes, but when we studied it more, it was really there were certain leaders that were not following their own rules that were kind of, extreme in their direction that led to some of this downfall. And so it's not the entire race, it's a few people that were corrupt.
Boy, does that sound like today's politics.
Oh,
Yeah.
preach it, sister, preach it, because that is so true. We saw time and time again in the gospel where Jesus went out of his way to comfort and to reach out to the quote unquote, the little people, the ones who'd been forgotten, the basic Jews. It was the religious leaders that he had no time for.
Good point.
That's all I got, folks.
Oh, okay.
All of those times that I ran over by like 5 minutes or so,
We're getting them all back.
we're taking them all back right now. We're taking them all back in this next 17 minutes.
Oh, Diane,
I-
were you trying to say something before?
Well, I was just gonna say, I think there's actually a bill in the House of Representatives that is making the equivalence between being anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. That if you are opposed to Zionism, you're opposed to Jews. And I think that's a real smushing of those two issues that we were talking about. But I think it's actually legislation that's in progress.
Mhm. Wow. Stay tuned.
I just chuckle sometimes that we think that what we proclaim or make all of these official proclamations, that they're actually going to have an impact on what they're doing over there. Because this is rooted in something far deeper than our ability as Americans to process logically. This goes back thousands of years. And you've got two people claiming ownership on the same piece of land. Ask the Hatfields and McCoys how that went.
Aren't they all descendants of Abraham too?
Yep.
I read something that said if it was ever settled, it can't ever be settled because for the one to celebrate that it's theirs means the exact opposite for the other side.
Yep.
They're in absolute horror of what's happened to them. They're left with nothing. Yeah.
I'd love to hear you talk more about what's going on over there, Basil, your perspective.
Well, there goes the 17 minutes that we saved.
It's just so difficult.
Pardon?
It's just so difficult to get a handle on.
It is. It is. And part of it is we get our information filtered through biases. And we get parts of the truth. We get sanitized versions, or we get distorted versions of what's truly happening. You've got these deep cultural hatreds that go back centuries. And you've had opportunities throughout time to bring about what everybody's talking about, bring about this two-state system. And in fact, when the United Nations formed Israel, they carved it out and said, you're going to be a country now, and they declared their independence, they actually offered a two-state system. And it was rejected by the Arabs. And instead, as soon as Israel declared independence, the Arab states attacked, and Israel fought back and won, and claimed a lot of this land now that the Arabs say were stolen from them. Israel bought a lot of things. It wasn't 1947 that it started. There had been Jews moving back to Palestine really since the early 1900s, late 1800s, because of the persecution they were undergoing. So they were coming in, they were purchasing land, they were building houses, they were building towns, all of this. And you had an opportunity to more or less say, let's coexist together. And one side chose not to. And things were fine for a while until within that other side came a whole new movement. That whole Hamas movement that more or less says Israel must be destroyed. That's not your average Palestinian's point of view. That's what the political leaders want. And the political leaders just happen to have the power and the strength to impose their will on the people. There are so many parallels between what was going on in Nazi Germany and what's going on now. But you can't even say that word Nazi without getting so many people riled up. But there's persecution from both sides. There's a hatred on both sides. There's a blaming that's going on. Each side is blaming the other for this whole mess. How are we ever going to find a rational, lasting peace? My honest opinion is we won't. We haven't been able to do that in 150 years. We've found periods of peace. We've gone through these times where both sides have come to their senses and say, let's stop killing one another. But when you throw in that added piece of Hamas, now you're dealing with terrorism, because that's really what it is. It's a terroristic movement. So when we're talking about all this, we really have to talk about three players. We talk about Israel, and there's groups within that group. But really, when you're talking about the Palestinians, you're talking about the everyday, ordinary Palestinian person, and you're talking about Hamas. The people that are getting forgotten in all this are kind of that everyday, ordinary Palestinian people. They're the ones who are suffering the most. They're the ones that are being used as pawns. They're the ones that are being used as human shields because the terrorists don't care. And to me, that's the sad part of all of this, is their lives have been reduced to being nothing. They have no value. They have no life. They will be used by the terrorists to get the results that they desire. That's kind of the big picture. What's the solution? Yeah, Catherine.
There's one problem, though, that the terrorists teach the kids to hate the Jews. And so that's,
Sure.
You can't control that. That's the bad.
Yeah, you look at our own country and what we did to the Native Americans, and what we did to the African Americans and the slaves. We taught our children to hate them, to see them as lesser people, to see them as not being human.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, we're still dealing with that. We're still living with that because it's still being taught. Susan.
Just as you were saying, within the Palestinians, you have the extremists of Hamas and Hezbollah, and the ordinary people who would be very happy with a two-state and live side by side. Within the Israelis, you have the same thing where you have the
Yep.
far right, extreme, ultra religious, ultra Orthodox people who want to take over more and more and more Palestinian land. And yet the majority of the Israelis would be very happy to say, you know, this is our territory, that's theirs, let's live in peace side by side.
They just want to go to work and come home at the end of the day and have supper and read their kids a story and put them to bed. It's the systems that are in place. And on one hand, I can't fault the Israelis for wanting to fight back, because when you've got somebody living right next to you who have sworn that you shouldn't exist, and they have sworn that they will completely exterminate the Jews. They've already been down that road once. They're going to fight back because they're not going to let it happen again. And on the other hand, you've got the Palestinian terrorists who that's their stated goal, is to wipe out the Jews. I don't see an easy solution to that outside of Jesus coming back. I mean, that's the obvious answer. When he returns, none of this matters.
Basil, do
Yes.
you call Hamas Palestinian terrorists, or are they a separate ideology?
They're Palestinian by birth and by name. A terrorist is a terrorist. Now, they're going to hide behind whatever label they want to put on themselves. But at the end of the day, a terrorist is a terrorist.
But they're very organized, obviously.
Oh, obviously. And that was the thing that was the interesting factor in all of this when they went into Israel. Israel didn't think they had that capability to be that organized. Yeah, they'd heard about the attack. They'd known that this was possible. They just didn't believe that they were organized enough to do it. Kind of like we got caught flat-footed with 9/11. We simply did not believe that somebody would have that capability to be organized enough to hijack airplanes and fly them into buildings. You know, we just didn't believe it. I think the world is starting to change in the fact that what we think our enemies are capable of doing are totally different than what the reality is. You know, we saw that when we were in Afghanistan. We just made the assumption that the Afghans would fight the same way that we do. We made the assumption that they would want the same things that we want. We make a lot of assumptions in our foreign policy based on our understanding of how the world works. You are never going to be able to break through the generations of hatred and tribal warfare that we're finding in Africa, that we're finding in the Middle East, that we're finding in all of these places, even in our own country. Jesus talked about it when he was talking about the end times, about what's to come. You know, the whole bit about the wars and rumor of wars and nation will rise against nation. When he says nation, he's not talking about political countries. He's talking about people groups. So more or less, tribe will rise against tribe. People group will rise against people group. And that's what we're seeing. The stuff that we're seeing goes beyond politics, and it goes much deeper than that. I mean, look at the divisions in our own country. You know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that we have got people in this country that hate one another simply based on if they put a blue or a red sign in their front yard. And I have a smoke alarm going off. My wife is making a pizza and our oven is our smoke alarm is very sensitive. So I'm going to have to go deal with that.
Thank you so much, Basil. I think this was very instructive as well. So we'll see you at the potluck.
So long, thank
God
you,
bless you all.
Thanks, Basil.
Thank you for this time.
thank you.